Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at the feeding of multitudes and walking on water in our continuing study of the life of Christ. Matthew chapter 14 sets the stage. Verse 1, At that time Herod the Tetrarch heard the news about Jesus and said to his servants, This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are now at work in him. Herod has a guilty conscience. He is the one who had ordered the beheading of John the Baptist, and now he hears about Jesus. The ministry of Jesus is on the rise, and Herod's got a guilty conscience, and he's beginning to wonder, could John the Baptist somehow have come back from the dead? John, as you remember, had been imprisoned in the fortress of Macarius. Now that's not told to us in the New Testament. That's actually told to us by Josephus, who relates the same story. And he had been put to death, and now that's past, but the ripples upon the political pond are still evident. Now when Jesus heard about John, and notice the words about John are italicized, but that's what's being described in the context, so that's what it's talking about. When Jesus heard about this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. And when the people heard of this, they followed him on foot from the city. So just like John had got out of the wilderness, Jesus is going to go to a sort of a cultural wilderness. He's going to go away from Galilee, away from the land of the Jews, to another place. And he's going there, notice, by water. So he's going across the Sea of Galilee to a place where Jews don't normally frequent. And after these things, I'm switching over to John's account now. After these things, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, or notice the Sea of Galilee was also called the Sea of Tiberias. And up to this point, Jesus his ministry has been around Capernaum on the northwestern corner of the Sea of Galilee, on the Galilee side. But he's leaving that. He's going to the other side, the place that's not normally frequented by Jews, and a large crowd followed him. So it's a Jewish crowd that follows him because they saw the signs that he was performing on those who were sick. And then Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. And we're even given a time frame. The Passover, the Feast of the Jews, was near. So it's the springtime, it's the time near the Passover, and yet Jesus is not going down to Jerusalem. He's not even staying in Galilee. He's leaving Galilee to go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Therefore, Jesus, lifting up his eyes, and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him, said to Philip, Where are we to buy bread so that these may eat? He presents a problem to Philip. And he was saying this, we're told, John gives us some commentary. Verse 6, he was saying to test him, for he himself knew what he was intending to do. We can look back and we remember what he was intending to do, but it was not known at the time. And Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for everyone to receive a little. Philip pulls out his pocket calculator and figures out what it would cost, and it's a huge amount. Even if we had, normally a day labor would get like 1 denarii for working an entire day. If we had 200 of those, that still wouldn't be enough to feed this large crowd. One of his disciples, Andrew, Andrew's not mentioned a lot. But when he is, it's been noted that Andrew is always bringing somebody to Jesus. And here he is again doing that. Andrew is the one who had brought Simon Peter to Jesus. And so one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, Here is a lad who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are these for so many people? And, he looks at the food and looks at the crowd, and he says, well, that's not much of a help, but he brings it anyway. And Jesus said, Have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down, in number about 5,000. And so here they are, they're seated, they're out in the middle of nowhere, they're not near Capernaum, they're not anywhere where they can buy food. They sit down, and there's about 5,000. And notice we're only counting the men, so there's probably women and children and others there as well. But 5,000 men. Jesus then took the loaves. And having given thanks, he distributed to those who were seated, likewise also of the fish, as much as they wanted. Now, we're not told how Jesus did this. I remember hearing a critic, talk about this passage, and he said, where did all the dump trucks full of food come from? And I threw it right back at him. Absolutely. Here's all these people that ate, and they would have had the same question. And we're not told. He was just able to distribute and keep on distributing both the bread and the fish as much as they wanted. In fact, it doesn't end there. Verse 12, when they were filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments so that nothing will be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets. We've got 12 disciples. They each have a basket full of fragments. We started off with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and now we've got, baskets full of leftovers because everybody's already eaten. They gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves which were left over by those who had eaten. 12 baskets, 12 tribes. It's a very Israelite-sounding miracle, even though they had gone up to the to another area. Remember, they had left Galilee. They'd gone across the Sea of Galilee, and they're in a lonely area. Therefore, when the people saw the sign that he had performed, they said, this is truly the prophet who is to come into the world. Now, when they say this is truly the prophet, they're not talking about any old prophet. They're referring to something in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, the Lord had promised, the Lord your God will raise up for you, speaking to, actually this is Moses speaking to the Israelites. He says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your countrymen, you shall listen to him. That prophet was a reference to a prophet that would come like Moses. Moses had taken the people into the wilderness, and through the hand of Moses, manna had been given from God to the people, and they had been fed in the wilderness. Here's Jesus doing something similar. It's not manna, it's bread and fish. It's actually maybe a step up. There's some variety to this diet. And they're thinking, well, this is truly that prophet. So Jesus, perceiving that they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king. Well, isn't that a good thing? They want to make Jesus king, but they want to make him by force a king. They want to make him a king that will do what they want him to do. And so Jesus leaves. He withdrew again to the mountain by himself alone. Now, when evening came, this is the same part of the same day, that evening. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, this is still the Sea of Galilee, and after getting into a boat, they started to cross the sea to Capernaum. They're going from the east side back to the west side, to the northwest side where Capernaum is. It had already become dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. And the sea began to be stirred up, because a strong wind was blowing. Now, this isn't necessarily violent, but they weren't used to going into the wind, and this was making it difficult. A strong wind was blowing. In Matthew's account, Matthew 14:24, we read the boat was already a long distance from the land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. So it wasn't easy going. Now, it's not like a big giant typhoon, don't think that. But they were having difficulty going across because the wind was not being user-friendly. It was blowing for them in the wrong direction. And then when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, I'm back in John's account, 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea. Now, they know they're not anywhere near the shore. So this isn't like, a couple of rocks by the shore. No, it's not like that. And the Sea of Galilee isn't shaped where it's got rocks out in the middle of it. It doesn't have any shoals out in the middle. It's quite deep in the middle. And they saw Jesus walking on the sea. We're not told again how he did this. This is obviously a miracle. And drawing near to the boat, and they were frightened because they were not expecting to see this, what they took as an apparition, walking on the water. Nobody had ever done that sort of thing before. Verse 20, but he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. So they were willing to receive him into the boat. Okay, come on in. It is Jesus. You wonder if you see something or someone walking on the water, you would think it's a person, but it is. And they took him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Suddenly, their journey's over. And it hadn't been anywhere close to being over. But now, suddenly it is. Matthew's account gives us some added details. In Matthew, we're told, in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea, and when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, it is a ghost. They weren't expecting to see Jesus. They weren't expecting to see anybody walking on the water. And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. And then Matthew includes this part. And Peter said to him, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. And he said, come, and Peter did that. Peter got out of the boat. I'm not sure I would have done that. Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water. Makes me wonder, was he sort of, surfing, or how did he do this? But again, reproducing an obvious miracle, came walking toward Jesus, but seeing the wind, he became frightened. Notice he's coming to Jesus, but then he looks at the wind. That's when we get into trouble. We begin to look at our circumstances, and that will cause us to be frightened. And he cried out, Lord, save me. And, the way artists have often pictured this, Peter's got his hands out, and Jesus is gently, reaching out his hand to Peter. I don't think, my own vision of this is Jesus grabbing Peter by the scruff of the neck and just hauling him back to the boat. And so immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him. Notice we're not told what body part he grabbed. And said to him, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And they got into the boat. When they got into the boat, the wind stopped. And as we saw in John's account, they were back exactly where they needed to be. And those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, you are certainly God's Son. The result of this miracle is that the disciples are beginning to see more and more who is this Jesus whom they are following. And they recognize him as God's Son. Now, Matthew's account, we just looked at the feeding of the 5,000. We were looking at John's account, but Matthew records it too. I am so glad, though, Matthew not only records the feeding of the 5,000 in Matthew 14, 15 through 21, but also when we go to the next chapter in Matthew 15, he also records a second feeding, a feeding of 4,000. Now, I'm glad that Matthew does this, because if he had not done it, if he had not recorded both, we might look at some Gospels that record the feeding of the 5,000, and then other Gospel accounts that record the feeding of the 4,000, and think that somebody got the number wrong, that somebody wasn't carefully counting, instead of realizing it was two different feedings, two different groups of people, and maybe even two different locations. Both on, as I take it to be, the other side of the Sea of Galilee, but still separated a bit from one another. With the feeding of the 5,000, we're going to see that Jesus feeds them starting off with 5 loaves and 2 fish. In the feeding of the 4,000, Matthew chapter 15, verses 32 through 38, there are 7 loaves and some fish. We're not told how many fish, but different amount of loaves. In the feeding of the 5,000, there are 12 baskets of leftovers that are gathered. In Matthew 15, 32 through 38, with this second feeding, this time there are 7 baskets of leftovers, and I'm going to suggest that is significant. Notice 7 loaves and 7 baskets. Now there's more than 7 disciples. Back in the feeding of the 5,000, 1 basket for each disciple. That's not going to be the case in Matthew 15, 32 through 38, with the feeding of the 4,000. In the feeding of the 5,000, it seems to be a Jewish audience who says, we want to make him our king. It's the time of the Passover, and they have followed him over. But it seems like in the feeding of the 4,000, it's a slightly different audience. This time it is a largely Gentile audience, still on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, maybe a bit further south, in the region that would have been known as the Decapolis. And I said that that number is significant. I think it's significant when we go back to the Old Testament, Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 1. It reads, when the Lord your God brings you into the land where you are entering to possess, you know how Israel was going to go into the land, they were going to take it from the Canaanites, and he clears away many nations before you, not just the Canaanites, but notice the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And then he sums up 7 nations greater and stronger than you. 7 nations. 7 nations. That's mentioned again in the book of Acts. In Stephen, in the book of, not Stephen, in Acts chapter 13, verse 19, we read, looking back on Israel's history, when he had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he distributed their land as an inheritance. So that was echoed in both Old and New Testament, 7 nations. So that when Jesus is feeding the 4,000, in the same way he'd fed the 5,000, there were 12 baskets full, representing 12 apostles, but also 12 tribes. Here he feeds what looks like a largely Gentile audience, and he's going to feed 4,000, but there will be 7 baskets full. As if to say, I'm here not only for Israel, but I'm also here for the other people in the world. So we have, remember in our map we have Judea and we have Samaria and then Galilee, and that area of Galilee is where Jesus had done most of his ministry. But now he's in the region, that southeast corner of the Sea of Galilee, known as the Decapolis. And it's here where Jesus has 7 baskets. I'm here for them as well.